that the words proposed to be omitted stand part of the question. The member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Budgets and associated appropriation bills can be viewed as instalments in the story of a government, and I think governments should have a story. I think it helps to have a story. I don't think it's helpful if we take an overly technocratic approach to the way government proceeds and just think about government in terms of dollars and cents, numbers, and dry programs and other kinds of measure. There should be some sense in which a government has an ethos, even a managerial ethos, and certainly some kind of vision or purpose that covers off on that part of a government's intentions that could be described as transformative or reformist. And we'd like to think that all governments have a managerial aspect, but they certainly should have some kind of transformative or reformist aspect as well. And I think that ought to be the case at any time in history, but in the time in which we all presently live, it doesn't much matter if you're not interested in transformative government, because that's being required of us. That's being required of us by the circumstances that we confront. And you can look at that in terms of climate change, you can look at that in terms of energy. Obviously, in the last 12 months plus, you can look at it in terms of the challenges that are presented by a pandemic. And this is not the first brush with a pandemic that we've had in the 21st century. And as we deal with COVID-19, we'd be foolish to expect that it's the last time we'll have a brush with a pandemic. The difficulty with this government, now 8 years old and 3 Prime Ministers old, is it's never really had a story. I don't know, I'd be very interested to hear from a member of the government or the Prime Minister, what's the story of this government? Very hard to put your finger on any significant theme, on any narrative trajectory or any transformative achievement, really, and I think that tells you something. It's a government that is fundamentally managerial. That's the nature of coalition governments. They see it as their role just to sort of steer the ship along. Well, that's the way they would have people see it. But they have failed to sort of step up to the needs of the times and the transformative challenges that we face. And you can see that in many areas. You can see that in terms of climate change and energy. You can see it in terms of the things that they inherited from the previous Labor government. The previous Labor government, 2 terms, 6 years, faced a global financial crisis that descended upon it in the first 12 to 15 months, and yet created the National Broadband Network, created the National Disability Insurance Scheme, created the National Network of Marine Parks, the most significant protection of a marine estate globally. So in a relatively short time, and in the face of some very significant challenges, took on that transformative role. The government inherited some of those things, and if they'd simply picked up the baton in some of those areas, they might have achieved something. But as we know, the NBN being the classic example, they straight away broke the model. They straight away moved away from a fibre-rich network that would have been the foundation of our 21st century productivity and innovation, and easier access and fairer access to social services, information, entertainment, all those sorts of things. And they said, no, you know what, we'll have a 21st century broadband network based on 19th century copper. We'll buy up more copper than anyone else on the planet, and we'll keep rolling out new copper and making use of old copper, so that at the point, when we get to the point of delivering the NBN much later and at much greater expense than we said we would do, it will essentially be obsolete at the point of delivery, and that's what we've achieved. The government inherited work that Labor had done in the waste and recycling space. We created the National Waste Policy and some product stewardship reforms and a number of things. That's really been abandoned until the last 18 months or so. and even in picking up that challenge, the government has found every way that it could find to do very little and to avoid the big challenges, the challenges in procurement, the challenges in infrastructure, product stewardship, labelling, all those things that are necessary if we really want to move towards a circular economy. Managerially, the coalition loves to tell one enduring story, or tries to tell one enduring story, which is that they're superior economic managers and that they're ideologically free. You know, that they don't have a value system, that they simply try and run things according to some sort of foundational and efficient economic orthodoxy. But we actually saw the value system that they bring in that space as early as 2014, and we see it in these appropriation bills and in their recent budget. The term that they used back in 2014 was lifters and leaners. The terms they use these days are class warfare or the politics of envy. I mean, what they essentially do is they divide Australia. They suggest that people who are already doing well, companies that are already profitable, need to be further assisted. That then results through the weird magic of trickle-down economics into benefits for everybody, and that it's the people doing it tough who really need to get a bit of a move on, courtesy of some governmental stick. When we talk about addressing inequality, when we talk about a focus on people facing disadvantage, when we talk about the benefits of broad participation in Australian life and the Australian economy, and how that kind of social and economic inclusion actually lifts everybody up, we get accused of class warfare. We get accused of the politics of envy, when in reality what we're prosecuting is the politics of fairness and the politics of justice. We've seen the government's skewed approach to that task, their neglect and dereliction of what should always be top of the list for any government, which is looking to create greater shared economic and social well-being. We've seen their dereliction of that task in multiple instalments. We've seen it through the pandemic. I mean, they were dragged to recognise the need for a wage subsidy in the form of JobKeeper, but they then managed to deliver a distorted version of what could have been a sensible and helpful wage subsidy, and their distorted version has been patchy and uneven, and it's being yanked away too soon. It hasn't gone to many parts of the community that need it. It has gone to very large and profitable companies that have seen their profits increase. And what have they done with those increasing profits? They've paid out big dividends, they've paid out executive bonuses, and the dividends have often gone to CEOs like Harvey Norman, to the tune of millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. So while local government workers and university staff and people in the arts and creative sector have missed out altogether, or have received very little, or having their support withdrawn too soon, we've seen literally hundreds of millions of dollars paid to profitable big companies that have got no intention of giving that back. And whether they have any intention of giving it back should be irrelevant, because it should be government's task to say, hang on a second, we got this wrong, we didn't have the settings right, but tell you what, we're not going to allow hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayers' funds to go to companies that don't need it. That's money that should be applied for people who are on the brink of personal disaster. That should be going to small businesses and enterprises that are on the brink of disaster. But that's never the approach this government takes. So to those companies that have received money they didn't need, some of them have decided to pay it back, and they should be applauded for that. But those who haven't have been left to pocket this government's largesse, and all the Prime Minister will say is that it's good for them. It's good for them to have the money. It's good for them if they want to pay it back. Contrast that with, of course, the industrial cruelty of robo-debt, where people were literally told, we're coming for you, we're coming for you. The computer tells us that you've got a few dollars that you don't deserve because you're a leaner, and we're coming for you, and we'll prosecute you, and we'll take you to court. I mean, you could not get a more stark contrast in the approach the government takes to someone like Jerry Harvey with $10 million plus of taxpayers' funds in his pocket that he doesn't need and he doesn't deserve, to the tens of thousands of low-income Australians, pensioners, unemployed people, veterans, who in many cases were told that they had received money they didn't deserve, and those assessments were wrong, and then they then had the living daylights scared out of them, and their relatively meagre material circumstances put further under the cruel vice of this government, because it wanted to tighten the purse strings at that end of the budget, at the end where people already have so little and could do with just a little bit more. The government delivered tax cuts to big business. They would have gone further if we hadn't opposed that. As I said, for low-income Australians, robo-debt. Tax cuts for individuals, the large majority of which go to high-income earners. Penalty rate cuts for low-income earners, again, penalty rate cuts. Why? Because we make the workplace more flexible and then more jobs will result. Did more jobs result? No. Any great surprise there? Does all the money tipped in at the top end ever trickle down? No. When you cut people's wages, people are already at the low end of the income scale. Does it actually create any more work? No. It just fattens profits and makes life meaner and colder and harder and less free and more full of misery for people who've already got enough of that. As I say, even in the context of the pandemic, the government has taken that approach. If there was a story of the government, inequality and inaction and unfairness, a user's manual. That might be the novel version of this government, this budget and all the previous budgets. And we see that broadly, as I've described, but we see it particularly in some sectors. We see it certainly with Indigenous Australians. Some of the key measures that we look at through closing the gap have not moved under this government. Employment participation has not moved at all. Employment participation for the population as a whole has increased marginally. Employment participation for Indigenous Australians has got marginally worse. The gap has got larger. Life expectancy for Indigenous Australians, the gap has not closed. The gap remains stubbornly high. For Indigenous men, the gap is 8.6 years between Indigenous and non-Indigenous men, and for Indigenous women, 7.8 years. Nothing has been done to address that enduring problem in Australian society. Take women who face economic disadvantage as part of the patriarchal and misogynist aspects of our culture, which persist. We know that. We're talking about that a lot at the moment, quite rightly. But look at the economic circumstances. The gender pay gap remains stubbornly high. The government's got no interest in doing anything about that. Labor's identified a number of ways in which you could actually begin to close that gap. Require the disclosure of the pay gap. Look at reducing the pay gap in the public service, something that the government has control over, because we know that when you address those kinds of things in the public service, it flows through to the private sector. These are practical things. They're not that hard. They're things that the government could take on. Superannuation. Women retire with, on average, half what men retire with, and yet the genius idea that the government had recently was that women should be forced, in circumstances of domestic violence, when they're seeking to escape that kind of scenario, women should be forced to draw on their super. So they've done nothing in that space. Deputy Speaker, people expect their government to put their shoulder to the wheel of achieving positive change, to achieving greater fairness, to achieving greater equality. This government has failed to manage the economy. It's less strong, it's less fair, and they've failed to step up to any of the transformative challenges.
Expired.